thing that I noticed was Deerfield Beach was without its own movie theater for the first time in almost 40 years. The most recent owner of the movie theater off of Hillsborough and Powerline, VIP DB Cinemas, I think they shut down in January last year. So even though we're not in a movie theater desert, we have them close by in Boca, Pompano, and Coconut Creek. It was still kind of sad to see after that theater had a 35-year lifespan with some interruptions. So when I started planning this last summer, I was kind of taking a little bit of a melancholy tone of things that have been lost but are still very much loved. So in true movie fashion, we've now had a plot twist. Recently, Paragon Theaters took over the theater at Shops of Deerfield, or Deerfield Mall if you prefer, and they reopened it a few weeks ago. They did a beautiful job with the renovation. So, okay, here's what they did. They upgraded the visual and audio technologies on all 8 screens. They refurbished the amphitheater seating, and they began options for food and drink delivery directly to one's seat. But back in its day, being 1971 to 1985, the Ultravision Twin Theaters brought similar innovations to Deerfield that could not be found elsewhere in Broward and South Palm Beach. The Ultravision process, which guaranteed distortion-free projection on an enormous curved screen with state-of-the-art sound, was a stepping stone between such innovations as Cinerama and IMAX. It really is a lost chapter, but it was definitely a great advancement in its time. But then nearby south, we had Deerfield's first theater, the Gold Coast Drive-In, which briefly claimed to be Florida's first triple-screen theater. They installed 2 tiny theaters at the base of the screen, and its early owners also floated the possibility of building an indoor screen in conjunction with the outdoor screen, an innovation that you don't really see very often. There were a couple of theaters that did that during the pandemic, that they were projecting on the sides of their buildings. But this fall is going to mark 40 years since we lost the Ultravision, and it's now been more than 45 years since the Gold Coast was demolished to make way for Rivertown Square. So before I continue, and I'm happy that I know the answer to the first question, did anyone here ever attend a movie at the Ultravision? Yay, yay. Okay, and now I'll up the ante a bit because this has been gone for much longer. Did anyone ever go to a movie at the Gold Coast Drive-In? Wonderful, wonderful. Well, after my presentation, there will be time if you would like to provide any reminiscences. They would certainly be welcome. So, in the meantime, for me, the Ultravision, if you've ever seen the Italian film Cinema Paradiso, the Ultravision was my personal Cinema Paradiso. I was 9 years old when it opened and age 24 when it closed. And that time of life when there seems to be the most concentrated times of change and challenge, that I started out at the Ultravision with Disney movies and children's matinees, and it led me up to midnight cult movies and the likes of Stanley Kubrick and George A. Romero. And then it was also where I saw my first star-rated movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, went on some of my first dates, and where I'd enjoy camaraderie with a lot of my classmates that we were frequent customers when they had the Rocky Horror Picture Show for a couple of years. So yeah, before we go back to the Gold Coast and the Ultravision, let's have a moment to think of Deerfield's early residents. And if you were a Deerfield pioneer, you were going to be waiting decades for the town to have its own movie theater. So the only option was to either go north to Del Rey, which was the most consistent theater, or downtown to Pompano. And here, let's wake you up. Okay. So here, we will start off with the Pompano Theater, which opened in 1927, built by the Kester family. And I believe this was before they started working on cottages. This was a Mediterranean revival building off Atlantic, not too far from Dixie, and it accommodated up to 500 people. And for a theater in the middle of practically nowhere at the time, It was on a level with some theaters in Miami that the Kesters made accommodation for touring vaudeville companies and also stage plays along with silent film. And this painting, this was longtime Pompano resident Charlie Lewis. He did some paintings from memory, and my special thanks to the Pompano Beach Historical Society for having his series of paintings.
Is that building still there?
Demolished sometime between the late 60s, early 70s. And unfortunately, for all the years it stood, it had very few years in operation as a theater. We do have one record of a benefit for Deerfield residents. The Deerfield Women's Club will sponsor a benefit picture show at the Pompano Theater. And that was among the many benefit events that they held for the local communities. And then upon its first anniversary, an unnamed journalist from the Fort Lauderdale Daily News described the theater's initial successes and noted one particular decoration. One of the most interesting and beautiful features of the theater is the marble statue of Christ and the Lamb called the Good Shepherd, which was made by the early Christians 1800 years ago and was brought in this country by Mr. Kester from the ruins of Carthage, Africa, when on a trip to that country.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, I've been asking some people at the Historical Society if they knew of its whereabouts, but it's been almost a century now. So yeah, basically any detail about the Pompano, it's just been little bits and pieces, not much has survived. So let me press the correct button here. So unfortunately, if you do a search for photos of Pompano Theater online, this is what comes up most of the time. In September 1928, the theater sustained damage from a 60 to 80 mile per hour hurricane and destroying the box office out front, shearing the roof, and ruining the interiors. So I don't know if it was closed for an extended time, but the next record I found came from 1930. The Pompano reopened on Halloween night, and new equipment for talking pictures was installed, and the Kesters had gone to New York that summer to get new decorations for the lobby. But unfortunately, the theater didn't last long as the Great Depression set in. But it did make a comeback in the 1940s. This was probably its longest sustained time open. Yeah, I kind of like the thought that some people got to see the Maltese Falcon in Pompano when it was a brand new film. And by then, the Case family was running the theater. And unfortunately, though, the theater was falling into disrepair already. And the Fort Lauderdale News had a retrospective article about it in 1966 when it was announced that as part of Pompano Fashion Square's development, they originally intended to build a community center. So given that the Pompano Theater was once a community center, they interviewed some residents that had witnessed it at the time, along with, by then, Mayor Kester. I believe he was the son or grandson of the founders. So one of the reminiscences was the projector would often break down, and when this happened, the lights would be turned on, and folks would visit with their neighbors while repairs were being made. Yeah, so at least they had some workaround. Dogs wandered in and out of the building when doors were left open in lieu of air conditioning. The empty orchestra pit, they also had a pipe organ and a piano as well. The empty orchestra pit became a depository for empty popcorn bags and candy wrappers. So then by 1950, there was increased competition. By then, Fort Lauderdale had a thriving theater row along Las Olas, I think about 3 or 4 theaters. And then plans were announced for a new drive-in theater east of downtown. And so that brought an end to the Pompano Theater. So yes, here there's, this was from 1966, Mayor Kester is at the right, and then 2 others commenting for the article were posed in front of the theater. Yeah, take a look at the architecture, note the arches, and the other offices and spaces in the building included donated space for Pompano's first public library.
It says popcorn but no movie theater.
Exactly, yeah, popcorn but no movie at theater.
Meaning it is the theater, but.
Yeah, it is the theater, but I think the stores were still open, but the theater space was pretty well shut off for its remaining years. So this would have been 1966. I found another article from 1977 referencing the theater and the mention there that it had been demolished by then. So then, this was likely the final lineup of movies there circa 1950. And then the building would eventually be demolished sometime in the intervening decade. And very little was salvaged, but I happened to talk with somebody who had an old friend who happened to rescue this from the demolition. This was a poster frame, and also continuing the theme with the arch, the very intricate etching. So the Kesters really went all out with the decoration. So now we move to Del Rey. So Del Rey Theater was located on 5th Avenue off of US 1, just north of Atlantic Avenue, and opened on Christmas Day 1923 and closed in 1959, and then demolished by the early 1960s. I believe a thrift shop from one of the local hospitals was then built on the site, and ever since then that was demolished as well. And the Del Rey continuously here, where the Pompano had interruptions of being open and closed, the Del Rey, it looks like they stayed open consistently through those decades. And there was one newspaper account that there was a time during the 1930s that the Del Rey was the only operating theater between the Palm Beaches and Fort Lauderdale. So this was originally built by the Hall family, featuring Spanish colonial architecture with hollow clay tile and concrete floors, metal ceilings, terracotta trim, and the dance floor was also installed on the roof. And it could accommodate 380, and it was especially popular with the local farming communities at the time, particularly in what is now the Amato Road area. However, the Del Rey, like Pompano, also lacked air conditioning, and since the doors needed to remain open, smoke pots were lit to ward off mosquitoes. And it eventually had a competitor nearby called the Roxy, which had originally been a silent movie theater dating back to 1914, but that closed up sometime in the 1950s, and then the Del Rey Theater followed suit. So now, as the 1950s began, North Broward welcomed the Pompano Drive-In on US 1 across from what is now Galoopi's. Opened in January 1952, it had an incredibly short life. It was only there for 5.5 years, closing in July 1957.
So it's on US 1?
That would have been on US 1 across from where the golf course in Galoopi's
Oh, really?
is
Right by
located.
14th Street, where I live?
South of 14th, just slightly south of 14th Street.
Oh.
Yeah, that where LA Fitness is now. LA Fitness would have I think would have probably been around there, along that little hairline. But yeah, my dad remembered it, but no, it was gone by the time I came around.
And what year was this? It got there and then 5 years later gone?
It opened in 1952, closed in 1957.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. And its demise was probably hastened due to unattended children and juvenile delinquency, and issues that were eventually addressed by city government, and they were threatening to limit the hours of operation. But management blamed the lack of parental oversight, noting how many children would sneak onto the property, or their parents would just dump them off for the evening and drive away. So then, by 1954, the ownership changed hands. The ownership changed hands, purchased by Charles Myers and L.L. Overton. In 1957, they would sell the site to Tunison, I'm guessing is the pronunciation, Properties, and it was renamed Tunison Park and zoned for single and multi-family residential construction along with retail. And probably the primary retailer on that site was Terry Ford, the first Ford dealership there, where now LA Fitness is located. But the former owners were not about to leave the movie business, and they recently had opened another drive-in. And so now we finally get to Deerfield. And this was a very vivid memory of my childhood. When I was growing up, I was born in 1961. Federal Highway had just so much beautiful neon, and this was one of the best examples. So the Gold Coast Dome was lit for 22 years there. So the grand opening happened on March 23rd, 1956, located on US 1 south of 10th Street, and initially accommodating 400 cars. Gold Coast was a nickname for the whole region at the time, and numerous businesses had adopted the name from realtors to hotels. And then for 22 years, this neon dome was pointing the way down the path to the box office, the screen, and the snack bar. So this was probably a little later than the 1950s, but here's the aerial view. We have 10th Street up here. In the corner was Deerfield Beach Bank, which was eventually absorbed into the Southeast Bank Group. I believe this was overflow parking for bank employees, but you would enter here. This would be approximately where the TD Bank is now. And we have the screen there, the snack bar there, and then the street behind it dead-ended there until the shopping center was built, and they built that connector there by that point. But just beautiful rows of Australian pines surrounding the property. And it's hard to believe now that this was a vacant lot for so long. That's eventually where Target was built. So then, with occasional exceptions, the Gold Coast did mostly double bills. And in this case, they opened with Forever Darling, with Guardian Angel James Mason counseling Lucille Ball to have patience for her workaholic husband, played by Desi Arnaz. And then the co-feature classic drama That Day at Black Rock, with Spencer Tracy as an investigator trying to find a lost person in a small town and meeting resistance at every turn. And then along with movie nights, the Gold Coast would be hosting various community events. They did the July 4th fireworks shows for Deerfield for several years. And they had fundraising nights for the March of Dimes and other charities. And Sunday services initially conducted by the First Baptist Church, which gave the advisory, worshipers will remain in their cars. So the Gold Coast was an immediate success. And then when the Pompano Drive-In closed, it ended up giving them substantial equipment for further expansion, and they were able to get accommodations for 100 more cars. A fellow named Jack B. Haggerty was the manager by then, and he and his son were mainstays of theater management in North Broward. That the father had opened the Gateway Theater in Fort Lauderdale, which next year that is its 75th anniversary, by the way. And then he would go on for a long career at General Cinema. So then by 1957, the Gold Coast briefly aligned with two other Broward drive-ins and adopting the name United Theaters. Now, this was an attempt to secure newer movies instead of secondary runs. It used to be that the first Broward engagements would be down on Los Olas Boulevard, but here they were wanting to try to get true first-run product. And even though a double bill of Half Human and The Monster from Green Hell might not sound like the most impressive first-run movies, this was a time when low-budget sci-fi and horror movies were becoming very popular, especially with younger viewers. But then whether they had first-run movies or not, they would be handing out handbills. They did this pretty much up to the very end. Listing what the current week's movies were, and they had frequent changes of programs. That this week alone, which was in 1959, they had 3 changes of program, and then at the end of the week, they reversed the order on Saturday for the sheet man and separate tables. So yeah, if you'd like to take a look at those prices for the snack bar.
Wow.
Yeah, that was definitely close to 70 years ago. And
Cigarettes.
but yeah, cigars, exactly. Yeah, to think that you could get some food for mere coins instead of dollar bills. And so then we have a could have been situation, and this would have been for both Pompano and Deerfield moviegoers. The Gold Coast owners briefly considered opening an indoor or hard top, as they were called in the industry, theater to accompany the drive-in. And this proposal was down probably in the middle of the article there, that the primary focus was on Pompano Beach, getting a indoor movie theater just south of Copans. This would have probably been south of where the bowling alley eventually went in. And at the time, the co-owner Angelo Manolo explained, there has been an increasing demand for indoor theaters by senior citizens, many of whom upon moving to this area find drive-in facilities cramped and uncomfortable. We know what the public wants and intend to fill that request. Now keep in mind that at the time, new single-family residential neighborhoods around here, including my area in the Highlands, they were heavily marketed to retirees, possibly even more so than families. But in the end, neither theater was built, but that would change 2 years later. This was the finishing touch to the 25-acre Shoppers Haven development off Sample and US 1. And Cinema Shoppers Haven opened with that Rat Pack classic, Ocean's 11, August 1960. It was owned by General Drive-In. So yeah, these were anchoring the new suburban shopping center, and they were doing a modern design that for their side, it was in the name of operational efficiency, but they were doing great accommodations for customer comfort. There were 1,200 seats when it was a single screen theater, and I have a vague recollection of the time my family went to see Mary Poppins. All 1,200 seats were filled, and I think it played there for months. So definitely a different time for the industry. And once upon a time, the box office was right outside the entrance. They eventually brought it
They had
inside.
air conditioning in this?
Oh yes, by then they did have air conditioning, and they even emphasized it in the ad.
Oh, that's
And there's that phrase Gold Coast again. So yeah, it was a very prevalent name at the time. I think it pretty much disappeared by the early 70s, that the early advertising for Coral Springs, the tagline was "the last piece of gold on the Gold Coast." So I think it pretty much fell by the wayside after that. And this was the trademark of the original cinemas, a beautiful shadow box effect. Surrounding the screen, illuminated with blue lights, which these were used throughout the cinema circuit for pretty much well into the early 70s. The architect regarded this as a suitable substitute for traditional curtains and masking. And this approach also had the effect of making the screen seem larger. Now, this one is not from the Pompano, but this was a design replicated from the original cinema in Massachusetts that opened about 10 years before. So then, 4 years after opening, General Drive-In, and just realizing that, okay, we have all these indoor theaters now, they changed their name to General Cinema Corporation. A certain engagement reminded that Boca Raton was also awaiting its own theater, whether indoor or outdoor. With this, unfortunately, thank you. With one of Marilyn Monroe's lesser movies, and even though that was a good attempt to break Yves Montand through to the Hollywood audience, they had the extra added attraction, Golfing with Sam Snead, filmed at Boca Raton Hotel and Club, but that wasn't all. See Sam Snead's championship clubs used at Greenbrier Festival on display in lobby, insured for $10,000. So Boca had been waiting as well. They had their own indoor theater not too long after. The Boca Raton Theater opened in 1964. It was located on US 1 at 5th Avenue, an established shopping center with a Publix that's been there since the dawn of time. And for their grand opening, Menke, they were known for staging very splashy grand openings, and they would do things like bury a time capsule, and what became of the Boca time capsule, nobody knows, unfortunately. But be that as it may, they brought Flipper, the porpoise up from the Miami Aquarium for the grand opening. That some photos there from the day Flipper arrived. If the fish happens to be Flipper, a 250-pound porpoise who has starred in a couple of movies, the task becomes more complicated, but yesterday Flipper was at home in Boca Raton in a temporary pool filled with water from a city fire hydrant and sweetened with 400 pounds of salt. So that was Flipper's second movie. The first movie, just simply titled Flipper, came out the previous summer, became a hit, and the success of this movie led Flipper to 3 years on television. So let me see here. And synergy is a word you see frequently now in business coverage, but Menke was practicing synergy long before it became a buzzword. Looking at the grand opening festivities, not only did Menke own the Miami Aquarium at the time, they also owned Florida's first television station, WTVJ in Miami. So the pre-opening activities had some hosts from WTVJ, particularly, and people my age that were raised here will remember this, Popeye Playhouse with Skipper Chuck, every morning, weekdays, 7 a.m. That was our entertainment, our introduction to Popeye and Looney Tunes during the 60s and then into the 70s. So then between the Boca, the Pompano Cinema, and the Gold Coast, Deerfield residents had a lot of movies to choose from. And then literally at the dawn of the 1970s, the Gold Coast opened 2 mini theaters at the base of the screen, which I'm guessing was originally storage space. And the 2 mini theaters, they operated for a few years there. And briefly, the Gold Coast was advertising themselves as the first triple theater in Florida. But that would soon change because we were at the dawn of the multi-screen theater era. So this opened up on the very end of 1969. I don't know how they did it, but the many cinemas were equipped with rocking chair seats, and they were mostly showing return engagements of established hits that 10 years later, by the time that The Graduate and Midnight Cowboy had their run in theaters, they would have been on home video and or cable by then, but that was still a few years away. So now that leads us to February 1971, and Deerfield Beach not only finally had an indoor movie theater, not just one, but a twin and a very innovative pair at that. And the Ultravision stood on US 1 just north of 10th Street. And it was open nearly 15 years, built by ABC Florida State Theaters. And since the early 1950s, ABC, as in the television network, operated a nationwide collective of various theater circuits formerly associated with Paramount Pictures, including the Florida State Group. Ultravision was created by another of those divisions, Wilby Kinsey, which had theaters elsewhere in the Southeast. And before the Deerfield Ultravision opened, several single-screen Ultravision theaters had opened already in Georgia and in the Carolinas. But as we'll see in the advertisement coming up shortly, this was the first and I believe only, there may have been one other, but they didn't do too many twin theaters with that. So Ultravision was named for its film projection technology, designed to ensure a distortion-free image on a wide ceiling-to-floor curved screen. And images from 2 synchronized prints were sent through a device called an optiverter. And a supervisor for ABC gave this explanation about what went on after that. It uses prismatic mirrors to project the film image onto the screen in a perpendicular line instead of at an angle. Angular projection has been necessary in the past because movie theaters must use 2 projectors as a film's second reel starts to roll as the first one ends. This method inevitably results in distortion, but Ultravision has eliminated this problem. Since the image is projected straight ahead, the distance from the projector to all the corners of the screen is uniform. This means greater sharpness, minimal distortion, and no fuzz along the edges of the screen. Contributing to picture quality is the 42-foot screen itself, curved to give every viewer the same image no matter where they sit. And to complement the Ultravision projection was the cornerstone for other luxury touches. And in an essay titled "The Mark of the Modern" for trade publication Box Office Magazine, a Wilby Kinsey executive gave a bit of an explanation. But before I get into that, since unfortunately couldn't come up with too many images of the Ultravision aside from the exteriors, the ABC circuit recently opened 2 new Ultravision theaters, a single unit at Pembroke Mall in Norfolk, Virginia, which would be right there. And then the other photos are of the Deerfield Ultravision, that they had the circular snack bar there that was able to work with both sides. It's a tiny image of the projector in the middle. The exterior view, it almost looked like something out of 2001: A Space Odyssey. And then this was the south screen, decorated in red, and then the north screen had been decorated in gold. And I have a quick question for Jeff. What was the seating here all these years? I thought they had an equal number of seats, but then I guess one had 100 more or so. Do you remember anything about that?
The Theater 2 on the north side had the most seats.
Oh, okay.
And Theater 1, they had a bigger area in the front. Actually, when they had the midnight movies, they used to have bands in there playing.
Oh, yeah!
It was a dance floor. Yeah, it was big enough for that. And also, when the kids' movies would play in the summertime series,
I was there.
then they would have them on that side. And I was probably the guy calling out the ticket numbers. That was one of my jobs.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
And well, I remember when they had the Don Knotts movie, How to Frame a Fig, and there was one scene of, I think it was, I forget the actor's name, but anyhow, there was a character that had died, and he was temporarily stored in a closet. And when the door was opened and the kids saw the dead guy standing out there was such a loud shriek, they probably heard it all the way up in Boca. And whomever was emceeing came on and started scolding the kids and going, okay, stop doing that or we're gonna stop early. So luckily they recovered after that. So then let's go ahead and get some comments from the Wilby Kinsey executive, Glenn Berggren, who had been promoting the Ultravision to various industry conventions at the time. At these theaters, the gently curving walls, eliminating the confining effects of end walls or corners, add to the feeling of spaciousness. Each of these theaters has wide and generous aisle space. They certainly did. There were rocking chair seats, plenty of room. And located along the wall, they had surround sound, state-of-the-art speakers hidden beneath the curtains. They had continental seating, which means no middle aisles, that it was just all continuous. So you had a little bit of a long walk if you wanted to sit in the center. It was worth it though. And exterior shape, trim, and lighting, planting, and decorative marquee, which can be read from a distance, and those 2 marquees certainly were visible from a long way, all fit into the Mark of the Modern concept. These theaters also have curved screen picture, full back rocker chairs, sidewall sound, lobby sound system for soft music anytime, and a screen picture large enough for impact and complete from floor to ceiling in height, carpeted and draped acoustic control in all areas, colorful decorated interiors of gold or red in the case of the Ultravision. And then at Deerfield, the concession area is huge, but being circular in a circular lobby with 40 or more feet of counter space, helping to move orders along more efficiently. And also worth noting, in the early years of the Ultravision, the curtains would be closed before the feature began. The curtains would open up when the movie started, and then they would close the curtains at the closing credits, much like a traditional stage theater. And the Ultravision's ambitious design was in keeping with Paramount and Florida State's tradition of luxury theaters from the circuit's early years, and they dated their history back to 1914. Well, here was the grand opening ad. This appeared in the Deerfield Beach Observer, so thanks to newspapers.com for accommodating that. So they were emphasizing entirely new, entirely different, and oceans of free parking, because that was still a draw, because if you had to go downtown for a movie, you had to plunk out a couple of quarters probably. So free parking was something frequently mentioned back in the day. It's certainly not now, and especially if you're in Boca anymore. So they opened, most of the attention went to the musical Song of Norway. Ultravision had the Broward exclusive on it, and then the other feature was a lesser Peter Sellers comedy, There's a Girl in My Soup. But most of the celebration was focused on Song of Norway, which I'll return to that in a little bit. So anyhow, this is where I was talking about Florida State Theaters dating back to 1914. And at first, ABC was remaining silent about their ownership, but they eventually inserted their logo where the sun had originally appeared. So as far as their history, here's one of their theaters was the Olympia. It will mark its 100th anniversary next spring. And it was later renamed the Gusman Center after Maurice Gusman saved it from demolition for a parking garage back in the early 70s. The architect John Eberson specialized in atmospheric settings, and here resembling a Renaissance-inspired courtyard. Once the feature began, the ceiling resembled a night sky with twinkling lights. And if you ever get the chance to go there, if you haven't been already, it is a marvelous experience. They've been having some turmoil recently there's some concerns about some cracks on the exterior, and the Gusman family is apparently fighting it out to reclaim the theater from the city of Miami. When Maurice Gusman bought the theater, he turned management of it over to some friends at the Off-Street Parking Authority. So it was a good idea at the time, but yeah, bad idea as time went on. But anyhow, yeah, if you're ever down there, do have a look. It's a beauty. And then a year later in Palm Beach proper, the $250,000 Paramount Theater made its debut. At first, it was only open during the winter season for one matinee and one evening performance daily. And going into the interiors, they had, they're kind of indistinct there, but they had some silk panels of aquatic scenes giving the auditorium a feel of the aquarium, cypress wood ceilings, and the tapered chandeliers there. And on the back here, there was a row of theater boxes called the Diamond Horseshoe, which when in the theater's early years, seats for the season went for $1,000. And looking back at the grand opening coverage, they published a list of the elites of Palm Beach society that they had all claimed the boxes for the time being. So Paramount had set high standards. Most of their theaters were simple neighborhood theaters, but they did build some other palaces in that golden age. And the Paramount Theater reputation left a remnant that is still very much with us to this day, as close as a few blocks east. Now, among the various names they operated under was one that inspired a regular patron who was thinking of bringing some of Paramount's qualities to a new business he was planning in Winter Haven. Years later, he would say the name Publix was borrowed from a chain of theaters which was operating throughout Florida at the time. Most of them were closing up, and I liked the sound of the name, so I just took it for my store. So, yep, George Jenkins was a movie fan, and Paramount Publix Corporation briefly thrived in the 1920s and the early 30s, but once again, Great Depression hit and they fell into bankruptcy. And Paramount eventually regrouped their owned and operated theaters and the Florida division eventually took the name Florida State. So February 1971 brought the Ultravision Twins grand opening with the exclusive proud engagement of Song of Norway, based on an operetta about the life of composer Edvard Grieg and his attempt to establish a Norwegian national music. It had an international cast, and representing the U.S. were Florence Henderson and Edward G. Robinson. And it was deemed a critical and commercial failure. It was, a lot of the reviewers were commenting that it takes up where The Sound of Music left off. Some critics were finding it really overly derivative of The Sound of Music. And one of the co-stars of the film, the Welsh comedian Harry Seacombe, called it a film you could take the kids to see and leave them there. And it nevertheless, though, played for 4 months in 4-track stereo and 70mm at the Ultravision. And opening night dignitaries and festivities were led by ABC's longtime president, Leonard Goldenson, who had been a former Paramount executive, remaining with the theaters after the separation from the studio due to antitrust concerns. And then United Paramount Theaters merged with the fledgling and, to be honest, floundering ABC network in the early 1950s. So as far as opening night, it featured film and TV star Woody Woodbury, longtime comedian and who probably did hundreds of shows in Fort Lauderdale, but also had appeared in some films. And then George Schott, Deerfield Beach mayor, was in attendance, along with Broward County civic leaders and representatives of the major film studios. But emphasizing the Song of Norway, the Deerfield Beach Senior High School Band, Chorus and String Orchestra performed recitals, including the works of Edvard Grieg. The staff was dressed in Norwegian folk-type costumes, and members of the Broward Norwegian American Club demonstrated Norwegian dance and traditional dress. And in the meantime, as far as There's a Girl in My Soup, it was a British sex farce starring Peter Sellers as a renowned TV cooking show host and habitual womanizer, meeting his match with hippie girl Goldie Hawn. So yeah, let's just say its shelf life didn't have much time. In addition to new releases, the Ultravision quickly became a community meeting place again for occasional lectures, religious meetings, which kind of predicted its eventual fate. And travelogue presentations were especially popular. I remember my mother and I attending one of these seminars. But the thing that I'm sure many of us will remember were the children's matinees. And I distinctly remember getting my scissors and clipping out the weekly coupons illustrated in the center. And quite frankly, I'm amazed they actually made money on 25 cents, given what all they were giving you, the giant bag of popcorn and a little box of prizes. And so yeah, that was Wednesday mornings for probably, in my case, the summers of 72 and 73. And then they would do the occasional fun shows on the weekend. And the first year, I did not know this, the summer program was organized by the city's recreation department. The Ultravision Splendor made it especially suitable for roadshow style premiere engagements. And dating back to the 1950s, these mostly supported widescreen musicals and lengthy epics. And these were the first these were maybe one theater per region, and it was presented on a schedule patterned after live theater once again, one matinee, one evening show. All seats reserved, and as they put it, an advance in prices. So as time went on and they would go on to more theaters, then they would be at popular prices and no reserved seats. But by the early 1970s, roadshows were falling out of favor, and musicals were especially hard hit, with the exceptions of Fiddler on the Roof and Cabaret. But not even Julie Andrews, with all the success of the roadshows of Sound of Music, she had 2 other musicals that died during the roadshow phase, Star and Darling Lily. And as it happens, the Ultravision happened to host 2 of the last ones. That For the Great Waltz, it was a remake of MGM's 1938 biography of Johann Strauss, highly fictionalized, by the same director as Song of Norway, Andrew L. Stone. And the Ultravision, I went one evening, And it was elaborately decorated with white decor, flowers, streamers all over the ceiling, and the movie title spelled out in big letters across the front of the theater. And walked into the theater, and sadly most of the seats were quite empty indeed. And then the Great Waltz only played a few weeks, and then shortly after, one of the Ultravision's Christmas attractions for '72 was the roadshow engagement of Man of La Mancha, and that was widely regarded as the final roadshow booked movie. And then from 1973 to 1975, the Ultravision also presented the ambitious American Film Theater series, film adaptations of renowned stage plays with the likes of Katharine Hepburn, Lee Marvin, Frederick March, Alan Bates, Dora Mostel, Maximilian Schell, and Gene Wilder, and with noted directors including John Frankenheimer, Tony Richardson, and Laurence Olivier. The series was originally sold as a subscription, much like a stage theater season, with only 4 showings taking place on Mondays and Tuesdays. And originally there were no additional plans to have these shown on TV, but they were eventually released on TV, and currently they are readily available on DVD and Blu-ray. And then, despite going up against a new neighbor a couple of blocks north, and the Gold Coast, even at this time, they were still scoring some prime engagements into the 1970s. They were among the Broward theaters to get the first engagement of Jaws, which played throughout the summer of '75. And they were also doing weekend flea markets, mostly to benefit Deerfield Beach High School. But by 1977, it was starting to show signs of age with second-run features and 99-cent admission at all times. And I had my driver's license in '78, so I was going that very last summer. And by then, the parking lot was more potholes than pavement. It really gave your shock absorbers a workout. And then Thanksgiving weekend in 1978, that was the final evening of the Gold Coast, a double bill of Jaws 2 and Gray Lady Down. And come to find out that at the time, the owners, the Hen family of Preston Hen, they had asked the city for approval to add 1 or 2 more outdoor screens, and then to bring a miniature version of the swap shop, which had started up at the Thunderbird in Fort Lauderdale and had been a tremendous success. The city did not want to deal with it. So with the land being very valuable by then to sell, the theater shut down. And then only a few Australian pine get the final marquee, referring people to go to the Lakeshore in Margate. And only a few Australian pine trees and a small patch of the former lot remained at the Gold Coast by the time the shopping center Rivertown Square replaced it in 1980. And so of all the evenings I spent at the Gold Coast, this is my favorite memory. This would have been Christmas 1968. My sister was eager to see the animated feature Yellow Submarine. For me, that was an eye-opener that animation didn't have to be Disney or Looney Tunes, that this was something very ambitious. And then my dad wanted to stick around for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and so by the time that started, I was nodding off to sleep, but not before overhearing the theme song. So not quite the normal idea of a lullaby, but there was just something about it compared to all the kiddie records I'd been listening to up until then, that it had it seemed like a very steady melody at first, and then all chaos broke out. So that began my admiration of film composer Ennio Morricone. It was still very tremendously popular, and especially with the addition of the midnight movies on Fridays and Saturdays. And these included such concert films as Led Zeppelin, The Song Remains the Same. I think practically half of young Deerfield was there that night. Yes Songs, Jimmy Plays Berkeley, and they would do revivals of past hit movies. They were doing a series of Mel Brooks's films in light of the newer movies that he did. Animated features like Heavy Metal, and then cult movies, including the ultimate cult movie of all, the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It played there for a little more than 2 years, and it featured the shadow cast named The Wild and Untamed Things, And I got to know some of the Shadowcast members for a feature I wrote for my college newspaper around 1982. And the group had started out in t-shirts and blue jeans, appearing with the first Broward engagement. And then they established a long residency at Plitz Florida Theater in Hollywood. And they took their onstage work very seriously. They followed actors' equity rules, and they started newcomers out with support roles before advancing to leads. And they also had very precise knowledge of Rocky Horror script, which was necessary for dealing with the many splices and missing footage in any theater's particular print of the film. I remember one of the cast members thinking that the Ultravision print had been choppy enough that it lost 5 minutes length. But that was the story with any showing.
Steve, what year was that?
This would have been 1982. I believe it started New Year's '82 and ran into 1984.
Okay, because it might have been earlier.
Well, yeah, I was combing through newspapers.com for each year it was open.
Because they, the manager at the time, Mr. Trellis, actually got everybody that worked there. We had a meeting. And to tell, especially the ushers, if you see people throwing popcorn, you don't, and I'm like, what? Because we didn't know anything about what the heck was coming.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a mess. I think the janitorial crew got like special pay during that period of time.
Yeah. But anyhow, here's a few views of the cast members at the time. The fellow playing the criminologist, his day job was working at Bendix Aviation in Fort Lauderdale. And so yeah, they stuck with it for a couple of years there. And apologies for the fuzzy quality. These were scanned from a yellowing newspaper. Unfortunately, I don't have the originals. So as the 80s began, they had several engagements that started during the summer and went well until the fall, very successful. 81 and 82, Steven Spielberg triumphed with Raiders and E.T., and then by 1984, Beverly Hills Cop, if I remember correctly, may have played all the way through Christmas. So they were getting a lot of business there, but unfortunately, by 1985, there were signs that the place was falling into disrepair and they weren't about to patch it up. There were multiple rows in the South Auditorium that were roped off due to roof leaks. And I went there one stormy afternoon to see the Goonies, and especially during the underground cavern scenes, it felt as much like an immersive theme park ride as watching a movie. So yeah, you really had to watch your step exiting the place. And so that brings us to September 12th, 1985, the final night. They had booked a return engagement of John Borman's excellent adventure film, The Emerald Forest, with Powers Booth playing an engineer assigned to a project in the Amazon rainforest. An indigenous tribe abducts his son, and then for a decade he goes back trying to find him. Eventually he finds his son, who is now total 100% warrior. And magnificent widescreen photography, what the Ultravision did most perfectly. I had seen it at a very tiny theater and it just didn't do justice. So I went that Thursday evening, the last night, and when I went in, paid my ticket, I noticed a little sign on the back reading goodbye. And John Matthews, the longtime manager, came up and thanked me for all the business, and I said, oh yeah, you're welcome, what's going on? And then he introduced me to a Plit Theaters by then, regional manager, who made it official that a church was moving in, the theater was closing, and that by the mid-80s, twin theaters, especially of that magnitude, were dinosaurs. So real shame that that only took 15 years for that to go on. The Christian Love Fellowship Church moved in, and they were there for 25 years, and then came the demolition. Oh, that's an appropriate sound effect for this. This was, at the beginning of 2013, demolished to make way for an Aldi, a Chipotle Mexican Grill, and a Panera location. So then after that, I'll do a couple of quick memories here of my favorite times at the Ultravision. This was fall 1973, my first viewing of Walt Disney's Fantasia. which had been a commercial flop for several decades until it was re-released for the stoner audience, who finally put the movie into profit, and Disney capitalized on this with a very psychedelic flavored poster there. So it was my mother and I and approximately maybe 548 hippies. So that was a very raucous evening. They gave Mickey Mouse a standing ovation, and then during the Pastoral Symphony, the sight of a bare-breasted centaurette led to mock indignation and calls of, "Oh, shameful!" And somebody going, "Oh, you mean this is G-rated?" So yeah, quite the most memorable evening I had with Disney. And then the midnight movies. This was a selection from 1979 alone. I can't quite imagine watching the Three Stooges back to back with a Pink Floyd concert, but yeah, I guess it worked. The first electric Western, that was an alternate ad tagline. It was also known as the first marijuana Western. And then in that mix there, my all-time favorite concert film, The Last Waltz.
Why
And-
marijuana?
Well, because it was a stoner movie.
Oh,
And yeah,
people
it
were
involved a cowboy
stoned
involving
for
marijuana, yeah. Yeah, early 70s, you know, but anyway. But there was one time in particular that so many people turned out, the line went all the way down the driveway and curved all along Federal for a good block or two. And the shows that evening, I was there for A Clockwork Orange. On the other screen, they were showing Dawn of the Dead. So while we were waiting, so many really interesting conversations getting followers of those two movies together. That was a very interesting evening indeed. But then this may be my favorite memory. In 1980, Disney reissued Sleeping Beauty, which this really showed the Ultravision at its most glorious as far as filming a really wide screen. It was filmed in the Technorama process, and you can't get much wider than Technorama, that it's more than twice the width as opposed to the height. Anyhow, the voice of Aurora was provided by Mary Costa, and little did I know that 10 years later, my next viewing of Sleeping Beauty, I would be seated right next to her. It was during the 1990 Fort Lauderdale Film Festival that, even though she was among the people suing Disney at the time for royalties from the video cassette sales, Disney was insisting, well, this wasn't the recordings we referred to in your contract. Well, the courts fortunately found differently in her favor and Peggy Lee's favor, and there were some other voice talents. But even with that going on, a producer friend of hers had placed the film in that year's event, and he suggested that she make an appearance if they could get a print for Sleeping Beauty from Disney. Now, Disney would only re-release at the time their animated features once a generation, but they did allow showings for retrospectives and film festivals, so despite all that, we managed to secure the film, and it looked beautiful. So anyhow, I wound up getting to know her. I was assigned to take her back and forth from the hotel to the theater, and then when it came time to drive her home, she specifically asked for me. So high praise, and she turned 95 recently. She's retired. She had been answering fan mail all these years being a Disney princess, and but no, she finally retired a couple of years ago, and so long life and good health to her. So anyhow, I got to drive her back home to Palm Beach, where she was residing in an Addison Meisner townhome that looked like something out of a fairy tale. And yes, it did include the staircase going to the ceiling for no purpose other than Addison Meisner's eccentricity. So we were sitting in the kitchen, and I had totally forgotten that I had seen her before in another memory associated with the Ultravision. Mounted on one wall of her kitchen, she was the co-star of The Great Waltz, and since these were the days before the internet and information just kind of came and went, so no, I had a very nice Sunday afternoon with her amid the chaos of working a film festival. So then, after the Ultravision, no theater in Deerfield for a little while. The following year, outside of Century Village, the Cinema 5 opened. basically the 1980s design of 5 small theaters cobbled together. But a few years later, a little interruption here. Deerfield was the first to get a Blockbuster video store outside of Texas. That Wayne Huizinga had bought the company, moved the headquarters to Fort Lauderdale, and asked his friend Carl Mayhew to sell several of his liquor store locations, being proven traffic generators. So I clipped out that very coupon, went to the Deerfield store that weekend, and started finding some movies I had looked for a while that weren't readily available. And here was another little did I know, a few years later, I would be walking into one of their scattered headquarters buildings along Las Olas as a hired hand working in the purchasing department. So then, a couple of years later, this is now Deerfield's longest surviving theater. It opened as the General Cinema Deerfield Mall 8 at what was then the Deerfield Mall, and Dolby Stereo, and they eventually did THX sound recording, or not recording, but certification, which was designed to let you hear and see the film the way the editors and sound technicians were working on things in Hollywood, so that they were aiming for the perfect experience. So General Cinema ran the theater up until 2000, when they suddenly closed all their Florida locations and they were gone a couple of years later. Various owners came and went, and there were a couple of prolonged closures. But now it has reopened. Paragon was one of those companies in the interval that ran the theater for a couple of years, about 10 years ago. They reopened the theater a few weeks ago. And this is a view. They have one auditorium called the Axis 15 Extreme with the screen tilted forward 15 degrees to reduce eye strain.
This is inside the Cinema 5?
No, this is, now we're back to the Deerfield 8.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that just reopened, just newly refurbished. So that's Theater 1. Theater 8, I don't have a photo of it. They have a multiplex version of an IMAX auditorium. They have the laser projection, they have the booming audio, so it's still a comfortable experience. But they did a beautiful job refurbishing the place. Even the smallest auditorium, the screen space is maximized, so they really did a beautiful job with it. And also the staff extremely cordial. That's not something you find very often in the theaters around here anymore. They're very helpful, they're very outgoing, so all the best luck to them. So now it's 36 years that theater has been around. And so so one last look from a distance, in this case, distance of time and memory. One last look at the Ultravision marquee, in this case. They did a promo photo for the Deerfield Beach Observer. Thank you very much for my running at the mouth a little too longer than anticipated. Thank you.